to all of you to the first special panel on day one of the 13th All India Conference of China Studies. Um, those of you who were not able to join for the inaugural session in the morning, the special theme for the conference would focus on China at Crossroads, New Directions in Politics, Environment and Economy. And the IIT Madras China Studies Center is the proud co-host of this year's conference with the Institute of Chinese Studies that has convened this annually for over a decade now. We decided that for the conference day one, we wanted to incorporate an eclectic set of scholars discussing methods in China studies research. And that's why we came up with this super panel of scholars. I'll introduce each one of them, and then Professor Rana Mitter could take over as chair for the session. As chair, as I mentioned, we have Professor Rana Mitter, Professor of History and Politics of Modern China, and a Fellow of St. Cross College at the University of Oxford. His books include China's War with Japan, The Struggle for Survival, 1937 to 1945, which won the Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature. And more recently, his book, China's Good War, How World War II is Creating a New Nationalism. Professor Mitter won the 2020 Medlicott Medal from the Historical Association for Service to History and is a regular presenter for BBC Radio in the United Kingdom. Welcome, sir. Next on the panel, we have Professor Kamal Sheel, who would be speaking on historical research and use of archives, given that our session is focused on methods in China studies research. Professor Sheel was Professor of Chinese Studies at the Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi until his retirement in 2016. He is now an honorary fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies. Professor Sheel had graduate training in Chinese language and history at Furen Tashui and the National Taiwan University in Taipei, and has a PhD in the field of modern Chinese history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has been visiting professor and fellow at the universities in Wisconsin-Madison, Yale, Copenhagen, Beijing, Singapore, and Taiwan, to name a few. We have then on our panel Professor William Callahan, who would be speaking on the use of visual methods in China studies. Professor Callahan is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science and is the 2020-21 Taiwan Fellow at National Taiwan University currently. Professor Callahan's most recent book is Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations, published by the Oxford University Press. His other works include China, the Pesoptimist Nation, published by OUP, and also the documentary film Great Walls, which came out in 2020, which asks why we hate Trump's wall and love the Great Wall of China. Welcome, sir. We next have Professor Abhijit Banerjee, who would be speaking on the use of language resources in expanding research areas in China studies. Professor Banerjee is professor in Chinese and head of the Department of Chinese Language and Culture at the Visva Bharati University. He did his graduation, master's, and PhD in Chinese language and literature from Visva Bharati and has studied in China at Beijing Language University from 1996 to 1997 under the India-China Bilateral Cultural Exchange Program. Dr. Banerjee has authored many articles and chapters in several volumes and has also co-edited a book, 中国情言眼中的印度, India in the Eyes of Chinese Youth, which came out in April 2016. Welcome, sir. And finally, on our panel is Dr. Usha Chandran, who would be speaking on sociological considerations of studying Chinese society. Dr. Chandran is an assistant professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is also an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, She's keen on using Chinese language skills to understand various facets of China, specifically the issues of gender. With those introductions, I leave it to Professor Mitter to chair this session. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and many thanks to Dr. Zhou and all of the wonderful organizers of this great conference. It's become a conference of great distinction over the last decade and more, and it's a real pleasure to be able to moderate this panel of distinguished speakers from India and from beyond. I should just add one quick organizational note before I go on, maybe relevant to the speakers and others. For some reason here on Zoom, my direct chat function is not working. I can read messages, but I cannot send them. So rather than discreetly letting speakers know if they're going on too long, I'm going to have to perhaps just briefly unmute myself and tell you if you have 15 minutes each. And if you're getting to about 14, I may just sort of start to wave a hand, and at 15, just briefly butt in if that is okay. I'm sorry to do it that way, but the Zoom function isn't fully working. Also, to those who are sending me messages, thank you so much. I'm sorry I can't reply. It's the technology isn't working. Right, let us, nonetheless, assuming that this technology is working, start, if we may, with Professor Kamal Sheel, and we've heard his very distinguished CV already from Dr. Zhou. Professor Sheel, could I invite you to start our session off, please?
Am I audible?
You could be a little louder.
Okay. Is it okay?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's okay.
Okay. So thank you, Professor Mitter. It's really nice to meet you and see you in this panel. And I'd like to thank Joe for inviting me to this panel, and also to organizers for being, in this conference. And so my brief presentation is concerns history writing and archives in the context of the status of Chinese studies researches in India, and also in the wake of newer evolving methodological framework for China-Indian studies. And I think one hardly needs to reiterate the axiomatic link between history writing and the use of archives. In brief, history at its best, or at its most basic level, is the act of unearthing and unraveling the living past for the present. In doing so, archives facilitate drawing objective historical narrative on the basis of primary period documents that it keeps or preserves for posterity. It helps us to recognize and understand the relationship of networks, connections, and mobilities, which play a major role in the making of history. Archive yields only if we approach it I think some internet problem.
We can hear you again, Professor Sheel. We can't see you, I think, but we can hear your voice. So perhaps you had to carry on audio.
Okay. So archive is only if we approach it with a gamut of questions. Multi-pronged question makes archive amenable for documentary evidences. Preliminary groundwork of event and its process help to harness the archive without succumbing to various kinds of subjectivity. Forms of connections and context of connectivity thus needs to be carefully worked out, and on this will depend the use of archives. Archives can be of different types: public, private, state, business, general, and thematic, but they together provide various links through many channels of historical events, interaction, circulation, and movements. The rendering of history is deeper and varied if the archival tradition is strong. Yet, in the current Indian scholarly engagement with China, the concern for the sources, the brick and mortar of history, is generally missing. This has been aptly highlighted by such astute commentators on the status of Chinese studies in India, like Tansen Sen and Madhvi Thampi. They have raised concerns that Chinese studies in India may not measure up to a suitable standard if remedial measures for bringing back history and archives in our universities' curricula are not seriously taken up. This has become more than necessary as the field of China-India studies is getting diversified and methodological framework for the China research, especially in the context of India, have been rapidly evolving. This is leading to the need and inclusion of newer and newer source materials to better comprehend the intricacies and problematics of this field of studies. Such lacunae in the program for Chinese studies may have emanated from fewer number of archives and less attention to expanding its reach to relationship with other archives. In fact, intensity in India are very less as compared to US and China. According to a tentative estimate by 1990s, as against 5,000 plus archives in the United States and 3,000 plus in China, India had only 50 or so registered archives. This happened in spite of a very solid foundation for the National Archives of India, led through the Imperial Records Department created in 1891 in Kolkata by the colonial government. This archive was further aided by the Indian Historical Record Commission established in 1990 and exemplary efforts of illustrated historian and chronicler Sir Jadunath Sarkar. It has henceforth brought to light, retrieved, and recorded hitherto unknown and unused sources, providing a different trajectory to writing Indian history. Does not match collections on China available in many of the famous libraries and archives in UK, USA, and elsewhere in the world. But as Madhvi Thampe's pioneering catalog of China-related materials based on National Archives of India demonstrate that still thousands and thousands of documents are available there in area of modern history. Besides diplomatic correspondences, they relate to all kind of movement of people and goods. They throw light on various military expeditions and deployment, political collaborations and interaction, businessmen and market activities, sharer of knowledge and experts, seekers of dharma and fortune, migrants and settlers, as well as on opium, tea, and other items of China trade. So far scantily used, their exploration, analysis, and study are likely to enrich Indian scholarship on China. In this context, I would also like to point out to those ignored sources that are in native languages and shed light on the nature of varied subaltern perception, literature open up new vista in our comprehension of areas of India-China connectedness. A comprehensive and deeper study of contemporary writing by native or organic intellectuals as published in books, journals, and newspapers in Indian languages facilitate a better comprehension interaction between the two countries. Such forays into comparative connected studies also further enrich our knowledge of their tryst with nationalism and modernity, as well as many modern ideas, movements, and activities. It may be mentioned that the half of the 20th century was a period of massive proliferation of mass literature. literature published in newspapers and journals in vernacular languages. These literatures appeared much more in such media than in books due to restrictive boundaries on publication created by the state. In India, not unlike China, literary magazines and journals in different languages thus mushroomed though many survived only for a short time due to financial problems or political crackdowns. Those which survived longer and established themselves were characterized by their eclectic nature, combining literary and informative news pieces with social comments and political observations. Combining local voices with national and international development, these played major roles in disseminating new ideas and issues. Fiercely nationalistic, they were beacons of modernity and were represented by numerous literary stalwarts and leaders in almost all the local languages. These writings focused on intellectual stirrings and revolution in the late 19th and early 20th century. These vernacular newspapers and journals, many of which were archived in regional libraries and repositories, are particularly rich and untapped sources that need to be exploited by the scholarly community. For example, many of Hindi and Urdu source materials in the form of editorials, reportage, introductory and serial descriptions and news item in newspaper and journals are available in, to name a few, such repositories like Kashi Nagari Pracharni Sabha, Varanasi, Hardayal Municipal Public Library, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Khuda Baksh Library in Patna, Raza Library in Rampur. Among the Hindi language magazines, perhaps the most important was Saraswati, which commenced in 1900 and continued until 1980s in different frequencies of publication. Saraswati periodically reported on China and expressed opinion and concerns about events there. Other periodicals that sporadically covered China were Kavi Vachan Sudha, Bharat Jivan, Hindustan, Hindi Bangwasi, Maryada, Madhuri, Hans, etc. Besides this, there were in the vernacular newspaper like Aaj, started by Babu Shiv Prasad Gupta, and Abhyuday by Madan Mohan Malviya, published respectively from Varanasi and Allahabad, and were influential Hindi newspapers that reported and supported Chinese tryst with modernity. In fact, the Japanese production of national history of various countries of the world in and around 1900, Babu Shiv Prasad Gupta and Babu Bhagwan Das from Varanasi sponsored trips to various countries to create a corpus of world history in Hindi. One of their associates in this task was the iconic sociologist and writer, Professor Vinay Kumar Sarkar. Similarly, archives of Urdu and Persian material, namely Khuda Baksh Library of Patna and Raza Library of Rampur, have in their collection many of the Urdu translation of late 19th century books on China. This includes several volumes of translation of George Curzon's Travelogs based history of China, 1867 translation of Lord Elgin's history of China and Japan. Others related materials concern early 20th century travelogue to China, description of Chinese Muslims and Islam in China, and commentaries on communist movement, as well as translation of Chinese stories and anecdotes. So there's a long list of Urdu newspapers and journals which also needs to be systematically explored. Some of the better known Urdu akhbars, a newspaper, was Jamindar, which referred to China quite often in its newspaper. So similar abundance of publications of journals and newspapers conveying native Indian opinion on international events from the late 19th century onward are available in other vernacular language like Bangla, Assamese, Odia, Gujarati, Marathi, and and are located in other regional libraries and archives. So our forays into these local libraries and archives also brought out existence of another important source material in the form of travelogues in vernacular language. The historical value of these travelogues cannot be denied, and they need to be put under the gamut of archive. Considered politically benign because of its title and category, these literature, in spite of being mostly written by loyal soldiers of the British native infantry, have subversive and critical overtones and present substantial narrative on contemporary India-China interaction. So
Professor Sheel, your sound is slightly breaking up, but just if I could let you know, you have about 2 minutes left. Thank you. Sorry that the connection is not very good.
So
please go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just yeah. So these so travelogues written in various local languages. They are also very important tools for learning about India-China connectedness, and they give good account of contemporary China for Indian audience, and they have like similar kind of appeal as one could say Xuanchang's travel record to India, which provided many light on Chinese connections and interactions with India. To be sure, it is not surprising to find soldiers writing travelogue, given the fact that since 1842, native Indian soldiers in thousands traveled to China from the three major forces of the British Army or armies of the princely state. They were the first Indian different language zones from all over India. There are very good chances that they must have left some records of their foreign trips in their respective native languages. We find involvement of infantry, sappers, and lancers from Punjab, Bengal, Madras, Bombay to Rajput, Sikhs, and Gurkha. More surprising, therefore, is not having hold of more travelogues.
Professor Sheel, could I ask you to begin to come to a conclusion? Wonderful talk, but we're getting towards time. And your connection is really not very good. I'm afraid I'm getting a lot of feedback and distortion.
Regional archive.
Yeah, I think sorry, Professor Sheel's connection I think appears to have given out. But thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Okay, I just wrap up.
Oh yeah, sorry, you're back with us. Okay, yeah, sorry, you're back in the room. Yeah, please do.
Okay, so I just say that there's need to use also online databases now available, and that could help improve the quality of archive-based research in India. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Sheel. And I apologize, well, really on behalf of the universe, that your internet connection was a little bit weak at times. So I think we just had to sort of let you know when things were a bit distorted. But I think we got the vast majority of a very interesting talk. And I think it'll give plenty of food for thought when it comes to thinking about Indian language sources on China. I see already some questions in the chat that we will get to, I think, during the Q&A session. So we'll get back to you, Professor Sheel, with some further thoughts from our audience. Wonderful. Now, let me turn, if I may, straight to our next speaker. And We move now, I think, to a scholar based from America, based in London, but currently working in Taipei during the pandemic. So truly cosmopolitan person, Professor Bill Callahan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rana. And I just want to say it's an honor to present at the All India Conference on China Studies. I'd like to thank Dr. Zhou for inviting me to talk about visual methods. Since it's visual methods, I need to use some visuals. Let me share my PowerPoint slide with you. Let's see, where is it? There we go. I'd also like to thank the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy for supporting my research in Taipei. I'm doing another project on the visual politics of China, so this topic is dear to my heart. Whoop, that's the wrong one. So visual studies is actually not that new in China studies. There's been quite a few people writing many books and articles about visuals in China and even visualizing China. But I think that a lot of this important research is still caught in what you could call a hermeneutic cage, that it's doing a very good job at interpreting images, but it's not getting beyond interpretation, not getting beyond sort of language, because typically a lot of visual research doesn't talk about visuals as visuals. It first turns them into a text and uses literary theory or sociological theory to analyze them. And I do that too. I mean, that's my training originally. But I think that there's a lot more that you can do with visuals, and that's what I talk about in my book that Dr. Zhou mentioned, Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations. In the book, what I try to do is say there are at least two important methods or approaches or strategies for using visuals in Chinese studies. And the first method is the one I just described. It's very familiar in critical studies. It seeks to deconstruct images and saying that images are social constructions. So here we go. I'll get to it in a second. The tagline is that we need to deconstruct the social construction of the visual to reveal the image's hidden meaning. The second method, which I think is a lot newer, it switches this around to look at the visual construction of the social. It switches the argument to examine how images don't just represent things, but that images can actually do things. So today I'll explain these two methods by discussing images of China's U-shaped line in the South China Sea. So maps are everywhere in the South China Sea disputes. You can't talk about the South China Sea disputes without looking at a map, it seems. And even in 2016, when the Philippines brought the PRC, or tried to bring the PRC to the UN Law of the Sea Tribunal, the arguments in the tribunal in many ways were a battle between China's U-shaped line map, which they tell us looks to history, and the Philippines map of its exclusive economic zone as EEZ that looks to geography. As we saw in 2016, legally, the geography map beat the history map. But in a sense, both maps share the same method, share the same approach by claiming to accurately reflect the real world. So for me, we need to think of this method to get around this sort of naturalization of maps to allow us to analyze them as social construction. So the first method that I mentioned asks the obvious question, what do these maps mean? So if you look at the maps from the People's Republic of China, they have political meaning because in the sense that since 1992, all maps of China are legally required to include the U-shaped line or the 9-dash line. So even maps in a historical geography textbook, maps of the Han Dynasty, still have the U-shaped line on them, even though there's really no question that that was China at that point in time. And now, we see the U-shaped line is found in other countries, kind of by surprise. on maps and globes that are made in China. So the maps and globes are made in China. They're exported to like New Zealand. And they have the 9-dash line on them because they are legally bound to have that on them because they're made in China. So that this 9-dash line is being exported around the world in various ways. And if you look at the slide, you can see a page from China's official passport. And starting in 2012, the 9-dash line, the U-shaped line, also is on China's official passports. So what's going on here? I think Beijing tells us that it's representing the historical facts of the PRC's maritime territory, which it tells us was stolen during China's century of national humiliation. So this image, whether it's on a passport or whether it's in a diplomatic cable, whether it's in a presentation to the United Nations, this image is used in international law and diplomacy to argue for Chinese sovereignty over this maritime territory. But rather than treat the U-shaped line as a natural or as a historical fact, the first visual IR method treats it as a social construction, like how did it get there? It's not a natural thing, how did it get there? And it's the job of researchers to deconstruct this image and other similar images, to look beyond just the content, to reveal the hidden truths by tracing the who, when, where, and how issues of the map's production and the U-shaped line's construction. And when you do this, it turns out that the foundations of this social construction of the visual are pretty weak. They're very unstable. That the PRC has never clearly defined the exact location coordinates of the U-shaped line. So it's on the map, but we don't know where it is in the world. That the PRC has never clarified what the U-shaped line means legally or what it means politically. Is it sovereign territory? Is it an EEZ? They've never been clear. And they actually have not been clear about what to call it. Sometimes, usually it's called the 9-dash line, but often it's called the 10-dash line or the 11-dash line. I call it the U-shaped line because that seems to be the most descriptive way of doing it. And my point is that even in official text, Beijing has never clarified what to call this. So to me, although it appears to clearly mark an international boundary, Beijing's U-shaped line is fascinating because it calls into question the function of maps. So the function of maps, we're told, is to accurately represent the Earth's surface. But as I said, Beijing doesn't tell us where this line is, so it's not accurate. It also calls into question the power of the image. Again, what does it mean? We're told that images kind of give us a certain stable meaning, but here, as I've said, according to official sources in China, there is no stable meaning. Neither Beijing's top government officials nor its top international lawyers have clear answers to questions about the location and the meaning of this image. So what I've been doing here is using the first method, the interpretive method, to deconstruct the image, to kind of speak truth to power, to think about what are they hiding behind this image. But in my book, I argue that it's actually not enough just to deconstruct an image. We can't stop at deconstructing the image to reveal its ideology. And the reason for this is that the impact of the image is not limited to sort of the factual questions, the empiricist questions of its scientific accuracy, and it's not limited to the hermeneutic questions of its ideology or secret hidden sources. The U-shaped line actually takes on weight and influence not based on its truth value, whether it's true or false, but it takes on value as it circulates around the world in cyberspace, on these exported maps and globes that I just talked about, and even on Chinese people's passports. Whenever a Chinese citizen goes abroad, they're bringing the U-shaped line with them wherever they go. So it takes on weight and influence here when people, I think, respond not rationally to what they understand, but people are responding viscerally, kind of in your guts, to what they see rather than rationally to what they understand. So for me, critical inquiry here has to change from asking how the image is constructed to ask how does it make people feel, both as individuals and as collectives. Hence, we also need to switch the questions and the method from asking how images are socially constructed to consider how society is actually constructed by the image, that the image is actually doing the work of constructing society. In other words, images don't just represent things, but they also do things and make things, especially political things. So if we switch the question from what does the U-shaped line mean to what does the U-shaped line do? Well, on the passport, we can ask a couple questions. The first question would be, does the U-shaped line on this passport provide scientific information for legal claims? I don't think so. It was very hard to take a picture of this page, the visa page of a Chinese passport, because they don't want, like any passport, they don't want it to be easily copied for fraud reasons. It's kind of like a watermark. So it's very weird that it's making a clear argument, but it's very ambiguous in the sense that it's very hard to take a picture of and reproduce. So my point is that rather than providing scientific information for legal claims, what's going on here is that it's evoking emotion and provoking emotion. So on the one hand, for some Chinese people, seeing this map kind of gives them patriotic pride. They're proud to be Chinese. They're mad that this territory was stolen from them during the century of national humiliation, and now they're, sort of enthused to get it back. Likewise, the passport map, I think, provokes anger among different groups. So for example, when this passport came out in 2012, someone from like the Financial Times went and interviewed people in Vietnam, and he interviewed a Vietnamese border official. And the border official in Vietnam was angry. He was enraged that this image provoked anger. It wasn't a rational argument about whether it was Chinese claims were better than Vietnamese claims. It was anger, and he was angered and enraged because every time he stamped the passports of a Chinese citizen coming into Vietnam, he was recognizing China's territorial claims over the South China Sea. So my point is that the image is interesting first because it has certain meaning, but secondly, it's interesting because it provokes communities, sort of emotional communities, what I call affective communities of sense. And these communities are formed both by connecting people and repelling them. Connecting people who kind
Bill,
of
could I let you know
love
you've got
China.
three minutes at this point?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, effective communities connect people by attracting and repelling them. I think that we need to look at both sides of that. So yeah, I'll start to finish up here. I think that my two methods actually kind of parallel the two meanings of tu in Chinese, the Chinese character tu. This is what I like to do in my book and my research. I like to use Chinese concepts and Chinese idioms to analyze Chinese things. And tu is interesting because as a noun, it means one thing, and as a verb, it means something else. So as a noun, tu generally means a picture, a diagram, a chart, a table, and a map. So this is a ditu. But also, so tu can have meaning to explain things. Usually a tu is accompanied by a text that it illustrates what the text is telling us in a book or in an article. But as a verb, tu means something quite different. It means to anticipate, to hope, to scheme, to plan, to plot against, and even to covet. So Chinese maps here are not just simply representations of reality, but they are also, images are tools in struggle. So this is what I mean when in my book, I talk about this shift from warfare to lawfare. So in the UN law of the sea tribunals, that was lawfare, using kind of law to kind of make sovereign claims. I think that we're shifting from warfare to lawfare and now to what I call mapfare, which is the use of maps for strategic gain in the battle for public opinion, that maps do things, they don't just represent things. So these two visual methods, I think, are helpful because they enable us to both interpret the meaning of the images, but also to escape from this interpretive cage that can't get beyond text, or that turns everything into a text. To escape from this, to appreciate images in a multi-sensory way, that you see them, that, maps actually, you can touch them, you can feel them. That's my experience in doing research on maps, that you don't just touch maps, maps touch you back kind of emotionally. So these methods, I think, are also useful. They're useful methodologically to understand images, but I think they're also useful politically because they can tell us how certain Chinese elites think about broader issues of world order. That is not just about how the world is, but how the world should be. So this map is not necessarily telling us where China is, it's telling us where China should be. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Professor Callahan for a very, very stimulating set of thoughts. And having read his wonderful book, Sensible Politics, I highly recommend checking it out further. And I see questions already coming in for you, so we'll get to those very soon. But first, we must turn to our next speaker, which is Professor Abhijit Banerjee of Vishwabharati University. And Professor Banerjee, may I ask you to take the floor?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. And also I want to thank Dr. Joe and ICS for giving me this opportunity to present a paper in this important China Study Conference. So today I want to speak, I have tried to see how the Chinese language resources is important in expanding the China studies in India. Over the last 2 decades, we have seen that Chinese has emerged as an increasingly important language taught and learned as an additional language around the world. By the end of 2018, more than 2.7 million people from 154 countries or regions were reportedly learning Chinese as an additional language through various modes. The rise of Chinese as an international language arguably plays an important role in diversifying the world's lingua franca and sharing the market of education worldwide. The teaching and learning of Chinese as a second language has also attracted attention in research, and for this reason, journals in mainland China, such as the Chinese Teaching in the World and Teaching Chinese to Speakers of Other Languages, are important platform for teachers, researchers, and policymakers to undertake scholarly dialogues. Meanwhile, more and more scholars are focusing on the Chinese language education overseas. With the improvement of China's international status, think tanks of various countries have strengthened the scope of China-related research. In this scenario, Chinese language teaching and research are booming. Now the question is, why is it so? One important reason is that Chinese language learning has become the basis for pursuing research on China-related issues. For non-native language students, Chinese language learning is also the only way to professional learning. Since the reform and opening up, especially since the 21st century, as China's comprehensive national strength has grown stronger, the global Chinese craze has also augmented at the same time. If we look at the China studies in India, then roughly we can divide it into 3 phases, from the 40s to 62, from the 62 to 88, and then since 88 till the 3rd stage. In the beginning stage, it was mainly focused on the Chinese history, culture, Buddhism. In the 2nd stage, from 62 to 88, when India's China Studies program started focusing more on practical issues, especially China's diplomacy, military, and development strategies. Since 88, in the 3rd stage, more and more Indian scholars are engaged in Chinese political, economic, military, diplomatic, social, language, and cultural studies. There have been large scale of cross-disciplinary and comprehensive research. Before the founding of the PRC in 1949, India has also a certain foundation for the Chinese studies. In 1918, University of Calcutta opened a course, but it has terminated due to the lack of Chinese language instructors. In 21, Tagore founded the Vishwabharati University, invited the famous French-Chinese scholar Sylvain Lévy as a visiting professor specializing in Chinese culture and Buddhism. The systematic study of China in India can be traced back to 1937 when Tagore established China Bhavan at Vishwabharati University. As the first academic institution in India to formally conduct Chinese studies, China Bhavan in its early phase put emphasis on the promotion of Chinese culture. To this end, Tan Yun Shan, who was also the founder, along with Tagore, he helped in building China Bhavan, published a number of articles which was published by the Sino-Indian Cultural Society. When the Indian academic and cultural circles knew little about China at that time, these articles played an important role in helping Indian intellectuals understand China. When Thanun Shan was the director of China Bhavan, he started a research project to translate Chinese Buddhist scriptures back to Sanskrit from the beginning and invited Sanskrit experts who understand the Chinese language to do this work. Now, this demonstrates the importance of knowing the Chinese language. If we look at the renowned scholars of those days, like starting from P.C. Bagchi to Pandit Vidushekar Shastri, P.V. Bapat, V.V. Gokhel, Shujit Kumar Mukhopadhyay, Shanti Vikshu Shastri, Ayaswami Shastri, Venkat Raman, and many more, they were not only proficient in Chinese language, but also trained in the classical, some of them were trained in the classical Chinese language. Today, in India, there are many universities and institutes where Chinese studies program is being pursued, but there is a lack of focus. Moreover, people are reluctant to train the scholars in Chinese language. In many of the private, state, or central universities, China studies program has no meaningful language requirement included in its China-focused, maybe MPhil or the PhD program. Some of the students are trained in Chinese language for only 6 months or a year. However, if we look at some of the other countries where students who are pursuing on this China studies program are required to complete 4 to 5 years of college level Chinese. As a result, knowledge about Chinese society and politics in contemporary India is extremely poor and mostly dependent on scholarships produced in other parts of the world. Thus, sometimes India's China study discussion becomes stereotype, full of ignorance. Definitely, many of these problems are elements of the broader neglect of area studies across the entire subcontinent. Now, why, if we look at the importance of China studies, Chinese language in India, to expand the China studies in India, if we look at the books, which Professor Sheel has also mentioned in his speech, for example, Faxian, Xuanzang, I Ching, written in the early centuries and preserved to these days, these are undoubtedly all very valuable sources for Indian history. Indeed, their names and books may be regarded as an inseparable part of Indian history and historiography as well. Curiously, the records and writings of those Chinese pilgrims had been little known in modern India until the European scholars translated some of them into English and other European language. In Xuanzang's records of the countries west of Thang and his disciple Hui Li's biography, records of the Tripitaka master of the Great Compassion Monastery, both the books contain a detailed and clear picture of the condition of India in general and those of the reign of Harsha in particular in respect of culture, education, calendar, measure, politics, social relations, agricultural production, etc. Even before Faxian, Xuanzang, or I Ching, many other Chinese scholar pilgrims visited India at different times between the 3rd and 8th centuries. Their records are writings, though might not reach a very high level, is valuable in their own right. These original Chinese sources throw some light upon the Sino-Indian relations in the ancient period and the interactions of the Indian and Chinese arts, literature, and philosophy. Here I want to take another example of a very interesting book called Tianzhu Nanchan Jiacheng Zhinan, a guide to India with special reference to Kolkata. Probably the date of publication is 1933. This book is a guide of Kolkata, especially in the British era, with all the relevant details of important places of Kolkata, the history of the city, livelihood of the people, population of Kolkata, festivals of Kolkata, and Bengal, undivided India. In particular, the life of the Chinese community in Kolkata, detailed livelihood of the people from parts of China in Kolkata, namely Hubei, Shantung, Macau, etc. Business and commercial scenario of Kolkata with special focus on food, hotel, government, industry, and fashion. Also about the education system of the Chinese community in Kolkata, cultural understanding and cultural lives of the Chinese community. China is a country with a large population, a large area, politics, economy, culture, history, science, and technology. The content is very rich. Although there are some introduction in English, the number is very small compared to Chinese, and many English introductions are inaccurate. Therefore, if one wants to understand China deeply and accurately, one must have to look at the source in Chinese language. The language, history, and culture of ancient China are inextricably linked with contemporary China. Chinese culture has not been interrupted since ancient times. So if one does not understand the ancient China, then he or she can't fully understand the contemporary China. In India, although there is a strong desire to value contemporary Chinese studies, but the reality is that there is a lack of high-level Chinese talents. Although India pays attention to China and studies the general trend of China, but the shortage of senior Chinese talents is bound to aggravate the uneven level of contemporary Chinese studies in India. Unfortunately, given researchers' imbalanced proficiency in English and Chinese, there have been limited exchanges among researchers who publish their works in Chinese and those who publish in international journals. Here I want to again cite some example. For example, in the China Bhavan Library in Vishwabharati, it has a huge collection of ancient books. First of all, in terms of the scope of its collection of books, it is relatively broad. Ancient Chinese books divided into the 4 major categories, namely classics, Qing, history, Shi, Zi, Qi. Qing is listed as the most important ancient documents. In ancient China, Confucianism is the dominant thought in the library. Here, the books collected are mainly Confucian classics. Also, there are books such as Wang Qing Jingjie, Xu Jingjie, Yu Zan, 7 classics, and Wu Li Tung Kao, as well as the dictionary works that explain the pronunciation of words in the books such as Shuo and Chiezi. Therefore, we can say that this collection of books in this library is a large-scale book compiled in the Qing dynasty, and definitely without the Chinese language knowledge, not only in this, also in the classical knowledge, it is very difficult to understand this, the content of these books. Now, what are the challenges that we are facing? Number 1, lack of national coordination efforts. Without serious and systematic attention to the next phase of growth, there is a danger that China studies in India could fail to prosper. We need to move from this let many flowers bloom phase of disconnected initiatives and lack of fundamental infrastructure to the development of language learning system that will give students and universities and institutes the incentive and opportunity to make the gamut of proficiency and literary development a reality. Quality, next is the quantity and quality of the Chinese language teachers remains the key bottleneck in building capacity. This gap needs to be urgently addressed. Lack of capacity for early language training. In many countries, language learning begins in elementary school when research shows that it is most effective. In short, in order for students to develop the cross-cultural communicative competence required by the demands of the 21st century, strong support must be in place. In this global age, to develop students' global competence is of utmost importance. Chinese language programs are mainly concentrated in metropolitan areas and selected institutes and universities. This poses a threat to both equity and quality. Another important viewpoint is that from the viewpoint of cooperative research, there is a lack of clear guidance and close cooperation between the Chinese research institutions and researchers in India, and lack of contact and interaction with Chinese scholars. From the perspective of information, the retrieval systems of most libraries in India are primitive and confusing, which cannot provide scholars with detailed and complete Chinese collection information. However, if we look at the many other universities in the world, then many East Asian libraries in the United States have introduced, produced, or used various informative networks to provide users with hundreds of Chinese language databases. The international situation poses new challenges to India's China studies. First, from the perception of geopolitics, China is one of the most important countries for India. The Indian government, as well as private strategic specialists, all carry out research on China. However, most of them do not understand the language, cannot read first-hand Chinese materials, and rarely receive basic training on Chinese history, geography, and culture. Their information resources are mainly from English media, which can easily mislead public opinion. Second, from the perspective of talent training, India is relatively short of these Chinese talents. The shortage of the high-level Chinese talents will result in an insufficient number of Indian sinology research teams, which in turn will affect the overall level of India-China studies. Thus, the key problems: personnel, language, specialty training, insufficient use of first-hand Chinese material, and access to scholarly and other research materials.
Professor Banerjee, just a couple of minutes left, if you would.
Thank you. Through the process of globalization, China has been growing significance not only on world economy, but also in political and cultural interest. A person interested in studying China can watch history in the making as China continues to expand its influence. Studies in the language, culture, and society of China lay the foundation for understanding the development taking place in China today and for building and maintaining contact with this country in the future. One important solution may be that India, in the China studies in India, can expand through intergenerational engagement. There are senior scholars for whom conducting fieldwork is not possible, and yet they make significant contributions to the field. Intergenerational exchanges on fieldwork and methods have the potential to expand the China studies in India. There is no doubt in the fact that there is a considerable interest among the Indian public, especially the young people in Chinese affairs, as is confirmed by the recent surge in Indian students' interest in China as a preferred destination for studies abroad. The Indian policymakers and private universities must capitalize on this to promote the Chinese studies from the perspective of India's national security interest. Think tanks in India may tap in bright graduate students or research scholars. Universities may set up departments across the country to accommodate the studies on Chinese language, culture, politics in order to create a pool of dedicated scholars and an ecosystem conducive to produce experts on matters related to China alone. This will serve the need for creating a valuable database of Chinese matters, which will be beneficial for India's foreign policy and diplomacy and Sino-Indian studies. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Professor Banerjee, for an extremely interesting talk, both in terms of the detail and in terms of setting out a really challenging agenda. I see that our questions bar is already coming up with a whole variety of thoughts for you. And when we've heard our last speaker, which we will do in a moment, I'm going to come back to questions to you and to everyone else on the panel as well, because there's clearly a very exciting agenda here. So thank you for that. But first, we must turn to the fourth speaker on our panel, Dr. Usha Chandran, who is at JNU. And Dr. Chandran, may I turn the floor over to you, please, for your talk?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Mitta. And I would like to start by thanking the ICCS and the China Studies Center, IIT Delhi, especially Dr. Joe for giving me this opportunity. I would like to share my screen if that's possible. Just a minute. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, we can.
So today I'm looking at exploring methodologies for studying Chinese society. So I'm not able to.
Have you been given the control by the organizer?
So I'm not able to press anything here.
If you're facing issues with that, you can just remove, get out of full screen and then use the normal controls if you're facing issues in toggling right now.
Why not try that? Sorry, I'm not very expert on these matters.
I'm not able to do anything right now. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Why not go out of share screen and then come back in? It may just be a sort of temporary glitch.
Yeah. So now you can see.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry for that. So in this paper, I'm going to, as part of the methodology, I'm going to explore the Chinese society, a methodology to explore the Chinese society. I'm going to attempt to explore the sociology of China, which would serve as a key to understand the Chinese society, the historical evolution of the Chinese society to its present structure. So as we all know, methodology is a significant part of social sciences also, as much as it is in any other field. But it basically, methodology just helps the researcher to guide and give them a path to take the approach to study. And following a methodology actually helps a researcher to narrow down the area of interest and problematize the issues of concern, equip them with the theories to understand and conceptualize the social phenomenon. So it also allows them to make their own, devise their own techniques and methods and tools and processes in this exploring the society. And in sociology, there is the sociological methodologies. There are several considerations which one should keep in mind while approaching the study. The when, why, and what of the theme requires careful observation of the researcher. Now, coming to the Chinese society, a study on Chinese society would first perhaps require us to bridge the gap between the Western theories and the Eastern social thoughts and the philosophy. So while theorizing a sociological understanding on Eastern society, one may not accept the Western theories which evolved in a Western society as it is. Rather, one would blend it with the historical experiences and memories, as well as the Eastern embeddedness and location of the East. So the failure to view the East, especially in this case, China, from this angle may and has led to several false interpretations and misgivings on China in the contemporary world. Now, similar to every other society, Chinese society also carries unique features, which are unique to itself, that is. And it is very important to study, it is imperative to study the sociology of China. From here, over here, when I'm talking about sociology of China, it means the social causes and consequences of human behavior in China. There are some basic principles that is followed by every Chinese as part of the collective consciousness of the society. Perhaps they are deeply influenced mainly by Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism. They are the three pillars of Chinese philosophy, as well as the post-liberation social transformation. Now, Taoist characteristics are claimed to be peculiar to the Chinese. It has exercised considerable influence on the development of Chinese society and the Chinese psychology. It focuses on harmony, genuineness, health, immortality, detachment, etc. While Buddhism, the only foreign religion which took firm roots in China, it brought in the spiritual and the ritual path of China into the life of Chinese people. It also enhanced their innate philosophies. And nonetheless, the Confucian doctrine on the way of life claimed to largely guide the material life and the pre-modern society, material life of the pre-modern society. Finally, the communist revolution disrupted the existing feudal stratification, feudal social stratification, and raised the social status of the deprived. So this is how we roughly look at the sociology of China. Now, one of the pioneer sociologists of China, Fei Xiaotong, in his 1947 book From the Soil, that is the Xiangtu Zhongguo, he tried to understand and create a sociology of China, so which would actually create a sociology for China. As early as 1930s, Fei and other sociologists recognized and identified that the sociological theories derived from the Western societies carry basic assumptions on how people behave, and these are very difficult to be applied directly to understand China. So though Fei does not mention Marxist analysis by name, but he clearly alludes to it in his discussion. Fei's sociology and Marxist interpretation of Chinese society were understood to be at odds, while Mao, a quintessential revolutionary, wanted to eradicate the old society and create an entirely new social order. In contrast, Fei, a quintessential reformist, wanted to retain many elements of the old society and use those elements to create and build up on a modernized society. Since the goal of social science is to discover the differences, the complexities and variations in the society, as well as causalities of these variations, Fei believed that there is a need to identify an ideal type in Chinese society, which can be then applied to concrete situations. The aim was not first to find a recipe to have a solution, but to describe the life of the people of China as it is. According to Fei, Chinese people generally follow the concept of differential mode of association, that is ranked category of social relationship, that is overlapping network of people linked through differentially categorized social relationship, which we'll discuss later. So here what I'm doing, I'm attempting to explore the four main features of the society as explained by Fei, as identified by Fei, to create a sample of an ideal type of Chinese society, so as to understand the basis of sociology of China and observe the changes and variations with time and space. Now, the first is the egocentric network versus the individual centric. So sociologists have come to understand that self-interest has a number of dimensions, in addition to an interest in the material well-being, as we all know, but it might also have the interest of how they are seen by others and value consistency through self-appraisal. So Confucian critique of selfishness and Taoist idea of detachment has been widely seen as a critique of self-interest in China. It is claimed that China follow a collectivist culture, and the only prerogative of self is self-cultivation so as to better serve the group. Thus, the group interest is always placed above the self-interest, and the individual desire necessarily seen as selfish and origin of evil. The idea of selflessness is one of the oldest value in China, presented in Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, and which was also later echoed in modern China by Marxism. Therefore, self-interest is quite unacceptable in traditional as well as contemporary China. So the egocentric network, therefore, is defined as the multiple linkages of self with others and the categorization of those linkages. So self in Chinese society is deeply embedded in social relationships and emotionally tied to personal obligations defined by relationships. So in principle, there is no self outside the roles and relationships. Individuality is restrained and emotions are controlled. Now, each link is interpersonal and normatic. With the above idea of group interest, above the self-interest, it brings us to the basis of Confucian representation of keeping the family at the center in the traditional Chinese society. So each family link is specific of a social role, carrying the obligation of reciprocity. Each family link, so therefore this is best depicted in the Confucian philosophy of San Gang Wu Chang, the three cardinals. So we can, which can also be seen as a power relation, the three power relations. Ruler guides the subject, father guides the son, and husband guides the wife. Now, every individual is the center of a social circle, and with his or her relation with others, which are hierarchical in nature and conduct. So therefore, we can actually see all major relations in China through this prism. The relation of ruler with its subject people to the government. It legitimizes power relations between people and the government, demands loyalty of the people to its ruler. And the relation of father and the son signifies the relation between elders and youngsters, and the obligation of the elders to follow and be filial to the elders in the entire social network. The relation of the husband and the wife signifying subordinated status of women, and the need for every woman to be obedient to every man, establishes the gender power relations and legitimizes its hierarchical nature. Through this prism, now we can see that how the system of moral governance is established, and the whole system. In this whole system, the individual is subordinated as the xiaowo, the lesser self, and the kinship network is of Tawo, is against the kinship network of Tao, that is larger self. The self is further reduced to his or her obligation of reciprocal relations and exchanges based on mutual favors with others in the society. And this kind of a structure re-emerged and flourished in the market economy setup when self-interest obligations were made to work through the Guanxi network. Now, networks have no explicit boundaries. Individuals do not choose, and they cannot actually walk in and out of their social ties. Somewhat similar to kinship network in pre-modern China. It largely works based on the 5 categorization of human relationships, the Ulum, 3 of them which we have discussed, and the other is the precedent of the old over the young, and faith between friends. So in contrast to the West, instead of helping the children turn to mature independent adults, the traditional Chinese family helped the children to turn into adults who are more firmly tied to maintaining the continuity of the family. Therefore, marriage in traditional Chinese hold the sole purpose of producing male heir and continuing the family line, so as to ensure that the ancestors will continue to receive sacrifices, this Chuanzong Jietai, continuum of the descent. With the modern monogamous marriage system, there are several changes, definitely. However, the changes in son preference or division of labor, etc., is scarce. The traditional Confucius idea on faith and trust among friends is also differential in manner and level of trust, though it was challenged in the post-liberation concept of comradeship, that is Tongzhi, literally meaning commonweal, one that is felt for all. But after the market economy, earlier concept of friendship re-emerged and they had renewed ways through the concept of Guanxi. Now, Guanxi can be roughly defined as a relation in which one does a favor to the other as a social investment, expecting the favor to be returned at an appropriate time. So some argue that its relevance is declining today, while some others argue that it is becoming increasingly important in new avatars. But however, it is largely agreed that the Confucian tradition of self in relation to others are continuing through the culture of Guanxi. Now, the moral conduct of behavior is situational specific. It's the 4th point, that is that the order and not the rules predominate the Chinese society. So filial piety is one of the most important principles to establish order, without which the entire social system will collapse. The order is maintained through people's obedience to their social obligations and the ruler's obligation to establish a xiaokangshahui, which is a Confucian term for everyone enjoying a bit of prosperity. The state and the party exists as a top patriarch, and the patriarchal control of families is extended to other kinds of association network. It is claimed that Chinese are collectivists, and this claim go often hand in hand with labeling China a Confucian country. Such characterization also claim to evaluate the political culture of China, indicating that Chinese are regarded as being culturally inclined towards accepting authoritarian rule based on a collectivist moral norms. At the same time, we also witness the emergence of a public sphere in modern China. From May 4th to present day, we see newspapers, think tanks, saloons, cafes, bookstores, literary journals, and internet social media have been mushrooming. And it has created a public sphere. The public sphere has gone beyond the authoritarian state's direct control, and the social space for the people to reach out to a larger domestic and international audience have been created. And now next, I'm coming to my conclusions. Unlike the Western society, the Chinese society did not go through a complete process of industrialization. Rather, it entered a socialist stage. So modernization of economy and infrastructure actually led to dramatic social changes, due to which people are enduring increased pressure, risks bound to work, they are facing risks, and they're bound to work overtime or even leave their family behind and work in other provinces. In addition to all this, the cost of marriage, parenting, education is increasing dramatically. Thus, in contrast to a typical modern society or a modern society as we know in the West, the role of family and Guanxi network outside the family in terms of individual protection, cooperation, or support between generations has become increasingly indispensable. And thus the concept of family and kinship, though in new packages, is in itself gaining strength rather than becoming frail. And finally, coming back to methodology, when we are looking at Chinese society, while approaching the Chinese society, we have to follow, one has to follow a set of sociological methodologies and understand the sociology of China, as I had just explained. And also, it's an imperative process to understand in-depth, to have an in-depth study on the historical history and evolution of the study of sociology in China. It is also imperative to look at how sociology emerged. And sociology, which is believed to be traveled from the West, started by American missionary teachers in the early decades of the 20th century. Sorry.
Wonderful. Thanks very much indeed to Dr. Chandran.
Just a minute, just a few more lines. Went through this,
okay.
So sociology went through this unification during the 1930s and had a competing status with Marxism, and subsequently it was abolished in post-liberation era. So, and it was re-established in the reform period, flourished in the post-reform with openness of questioning during globalization. And lately it is faced with this cultural nationalist efforts to revitalize traditions as markers of identities. One of the main tools for an in-depth understanding on Chinese society is the Chinese language, which can open several doors for the researcher to easily permeate into the society and work his or her way out to understand the culture, thoughts, and beliefs and way of life. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Chandran. In fact, your timing was absolutely perfect. That was bang on 15 minutes. So wonderful judgment as well as a very interesting talk indeed. Thank you all for panelists for fantastic comments in quite a wide variety of areas, but with a set theme, I think, of the importance of using Chinese language materials and the way in which data can be put together. I see that it's sparked a lively debate in the chat section for questions to bring to you. And, you know, our time is limited, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do as chair is to bring together some of the questions in a sort of more focused way and throw at least one to each of our panel members. So I'm going to return first, if I may, to Professor Abhijit Banerjee, because actually a lot of the different questions have come in. I see one from Ambassador Kishan Rana and quite a few others as well. Really, they're phrased differently, but they all center on a very specific point which you raised. So I'm going to put that back to you and get your thoughts, if I may. That is the idea that everyone, I mean, obviously we're in a biased group since the many hundreds of people on this call have an interest in Chinese studies, but the idea that India isn't doing enough to nurture research on China that is based in an understanding of Chinese language, although of course many people on this panel and others are very much exceptions to that. And also beyond that, that the focus of study, some of the questions have said, is too much on the inevitable question of bilaterals, on the clash in Ladakh, the memories of 1962, all of the things that we know about. So I guess the question to you, Professor Banerjee, is what can be done in practice about the Mandarin language question, and what can be done in conceptual terms to widen the way that Indian scholarship and policymaking engages with China? So to you first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have seen also some of the questions. The first thing
Sure.
is that one question was also aimed at the India's education policy, new education policy, from where Chinese was suddenly dropped. The thing is that in spite of all this, the Galwan incident or the India-China recent deterioration in the relations, most of the universities where the Chinese language courses are going on, the seats are filled up. Almost in most of the courses. The thing is that the young Indian people have their interest in the Chinese language. Now I'm talking about this in the Chinese language section in the state and private and central universities where the Chinese language courses are being pursued. So here one point is that the people in India or the young students who are after class 12, they are still interested in learning the Chinese language. Here comes the universities, the Ministry of Education, and overall, our Ministry of External Affairs, they are very clear of the knowledge that without a proper understanding of the language, it is very difficult to deal with China, even in politics, even in diplomacy, in defense, anywhere. So I know that this thing needs to be solved by the Ministry of Education and also by the Ministry of External Affairs, because the universities can do up to one level. After that level, they cannot solve the issues. The issues needs to be solved from the top. So one point is that we can, taking into full consideration of our own interest, of our national interest, we have to continue with the Chinese language program, not only in the big places, but also in small towns. And I'm sure, because this pool of Chinese talents we will definitely require after 4-5 years, or else if we not go with nurturing the young talents, then after 5-6 years, there will be a huge problem, huge dearth of Chinese talents in India, which in consequence will be a great problem for India in understanding China in all the field. So I think is that the Ministry of Education in India and Ministry of External Affairs can themselves have to solve the problem in collaboration, in contact with the universities, because universities have a certain constraint to do it. Unless they get the nod from the top level, they cannot go with this. Some private players can do this, but most of the central universities or the state universities have to get the nod from the top level. But still, I am very optimistic, and I'm sure that in spite of the deterioration, till now, there has been no problem in learning Chinese language. We are continuing with this. Scholarships are also provided in the last 2 months by the Ministry of Education to many Indian students for learning Chinese language in China or now in online mode. So that means is that some of the top, the government agencies are also in that way not providing an obstacle for Chinese language teaching in India.
Thanks very much indeed, Professor Banerjee. Some fantastic answers to a lot of really urgent questions. And I think throughout the course of the conference, more people will pick them up. I want to just make sure that everyone gets a reply to some of the questions. And I'm going to turn back to Professor Usha Chandran, if I may. There's several questions come to you, but I'm going to put together two particularly interesting ones, if I may. One is about your idea of the collectivist society. And I recognized and appreciate your reference to Professor Fei Xiaotung, I think still, perhaps the greatest Chinese sociologist and one of the greatest sociologists at all of the 20th century. So the question comes in, it's from Nayan Thakurani. How would you explain the rise of individualism in post-reform China? And does the state have anything to do with it? And just linking to that, a more mischievous, but I think very good question there from Kiran Kankoje. Could Professor Usha spell out how different Indian society is from Chinese society in those three aspects that you mentioned in your talk? So I'll throw those two back to you, Dr. Chandran, if I may.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very, very interesting questions. Yes, I would, if I start with the first way, like talking about the Indian society, there are several similarities definitely, but one cannot put them in the same box definitely, because there are different. If you're looking at the three relations, yeah, I can say that there are similarities, but they are different in some ways or the other. We can compare them definitely. It's a very good field of comparative study, but we cannot jump to conclusions that they are same, because there are definitely there are similarities and differences in Indian society also. And coming to the question, sorry, what was the question on
society? So the question, well, there's actually a couple of them, but putting them together really, what's the role of individualism as opposed to collectivism, particularly in the post-reform era, and the role of the state and, you know, going through the communist revolution?
Yes.
What significance does it have?
Yes, I would say in the post-reform period, definitely the state has a very important role in promoting individualism, so that people think for themselves and start start their own business and xiang qian kan, so that they start earning their money and all that. However, what my point was that there is a definite kind of a linkage. Even the individualistic Chinese is linked to his or her kinship or family, and so it's not extremely individualistic as we see it in West. The idea of individualism is again, and even the new kind of individualism in China is not exactly similar to the Western idea of individualism. But yeah, even that in that individual kind of understanding, there is a kinship network, which is, I will not call it kinship, with maybe Guanxi network, which is more like something which is suitable to you, so that you can go ahead in life, so that you can take help from people to again for individualistic purpose, but then you still have relations. So you have, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's mutual. And there's another question on socialism, I think, that whether we would look at Chinese society, what is the impact of socialism in Chinese society? I would say that ideologically, yes, but as we all know that socialism is defined is continually being redefined, and therefore, yeah, so socialism with Chinese characteristics, yes, it is an important part of ideological part of Chinese people. The culture.
Thanks so much, Dr. Chandran. I'm going to turn to Professor Callahan and put together a couple of the very interesting questions that have come in a sort of combined form. One question, Bill, is about social media today in China, in understanding how that helps the construction, I would say also transmission of images, and where one locates the Chinese, as the question from Rita Naya puts it, Chinese propaganda machinery in this context. And adding to that, I think the question that comes below from Bisuba is, how far do maps influence ordinary Chinese citizens? That's apart from, kind of top cadres. How widespread is the influence of these ideas? Someone's also made a comparison, actually, of course, with maps of India, which are a very sensitive thing. You have to make sure the map is politically acceptable to have it in a book that's distributed in India. So it is, of course, not just China that does the politics of map fair, as you put it. So, Bill, back to you.
Thanks, Rana. I think that I'll answer the second question first. I think that the maps are quite influential amongst lots of different groups of Chinese. And I mean, it's always a question when you study public representations in China, whether it's just propaganda or it's what they really believe. And I think that especially with maps, there's something sort of visceral when my Chinese friends and colleagues look at a map and they feel something. So when I was doing research on national humiliation maps 20 years ago, I would go to the National Library in Beijing, and I would get these big maps that take up a whole, they're as large as a dinner table. They're meant for hanging on a wall of a classroom. And so these middle-aged men would sort of come around and look at what I was doing, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's when Mongolia was still ours. Gosh. And so I think that these maps really touch people. And I think that the U-shaped line maps don't touch people in sort of a nostalgic way about, oh, Mongolia should be ours. But it's more of the anger is like, gosh darn it, the US or Japan or the ROC stole the South China Sea from China, blah, blah, blah. So I think they're very They're very powerful among all groups, including elite groups. The social media question is very, I mean, interesting, fascinating. I have a chapter about that in my book. And my argument is that you can use my two methods to understand social media in China, and that the sort of the first thing about the social construction of the image, you can see that in the way the government controls images and text in China through the Great Firewall in a very kind of blunt way of blocking what they see as negative or unhealthy images. But also, it's not just about censorship. You need to go beyond this censorship to think about how the Wumao, the official trolls in China, when you look at what they do, they generally don't say negative things. They don't sort of criticize dissidents for being traitors or being stupid. They don't mention negative things. Their job is generally to promote positivity, positive energy, as Xi Jinping tells us, and just to say how great the party is, how the party's working for you, or how great China is in the world. But I think if we go on to the social media that we're all familiar with now, this is really the Internet 2.0, where it's not just the companies giving us information like the New York Times website. It's our job as individual participants to give content, to create content on the internet. So it's not just the government restricting content through the Great Firewall. They're trying to provoke and persuade all of us, if we're all Chinese citizens, all Chinese people, to add content to that is sort of supportive of China, but also to watch each other. That the way you say surveillance in Chinese is inspection and control. That it's not just watching, it's controlling. And that's what you need to remember, especially in China, is that these individual users need to not watch each other and police each other to some extent. So we see that in Alibaba's Sesame Credit. We see it in the social credit system, which is still developing, but I think it really is going to change the way the internet works, not just in China, but for the rest of us. So that's where I think how social media can be analyzed in this way. So I'll just stop there so other people can talk.
Thanks so much, Bill. I know with all these we could go on much longer, but the tea break is coming. I want to make sure that we get Professor Kamal-Sheel in, because you're getting some great questions in there, really fascinated by this idea of Indian language sources to tell China stories. So I'm going to combine the questions from Bhavana Dugar and Indranil Bhole. And the questions being asked really is there any bibliography or any way of finding out about these, as they say, native language publications, sort of indigenous Indian language publications, giving China stories? So could Professor Sheel tell us a little bit about that? How can interested scholars go about actually practically tackling finding these materials and finding out these unknown China stories? If we still have Professor Sheel with us on the call, or did the internet give out? Oh,
we do, but he is not unmuting himself.
Could you unmute Professor Sheel? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yes. Come on. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, unstable internet. So
Sorry.
Actually, for national art, there's there like two catalogs by Madhvi Thampi on materials available there in National Archives. But for regional archives, we do not have any say comprehensive record of language materials, regional language materials from China. So that is the task that should be done, and it would be very informative and very useful to look at India-China connectedness, because now we are trying to look China from many different ways, especially comparative, connected, and what Dwara calls convergent, this connection. So for these kind of studies or methodological approach, we need to get all kind of sources to develop link and narratives. So that is one thing that requires to be taken up urgently, and hope Yeah, that could be done. And
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Shield, for that advice. And again, there's so many questions that we could go on for much longer, but I know the tea break is waiting us. I just want to speak on behalf of everyone, I'm sure, first of all, to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Chandran, Professor Callahan, Professor Banerjee, Professor Shield, for their very, very insightful and detailed talks. To Dr. Joe, and also old friends like Professor Madhavi and others who are involved with this, and also the whole conference organized by ICS and partners, which has remained a very, very important sort of touchstone for the pursuit of Chinese studies in India. And I feel very honored to have been part of it today. I know there's a tea break coming up. I just want to check with Dr. Joe if there's anything else you need to announce to the gathered group before we break.
No, just a word of gratitude to our panelists and to you, Professor Mitter, for leading us into a very engaging discussion on exploring unknown China stories, on exploring regional knowledge systems, on the use of visual methods, and two of our professors discussing sociological considerations and use of language resources. So just a word of gratitude. And also for the information of the audience, we will regroup at 4:15 p.m. That's 4:15 India time for the first thematic panel on the politics of ecology in the PRC. My colleagues Rija and Madhurima will be taking you through that session. So I hope we reconvene that time. Thank you once again to all our panelists and the chair.